roadmap, and we had great response to this session, so that leads me to believe that many of you are interested in how you might go about creating a crisis communication roadmap for your school or organization. So thank you so very much for taking the time to join us today. And for those of you in the education market, hope your year is off to a great start. I am going to let you know that we are talking to you today, some of us from the Southeast in Charleston, South Carolina. And so today we are also joined by our moderator, Bill Baker, who's our VP of Operations in our Atlanta office. And Bill is going to be there just in case for some reason we lose power or connectivity. Bill's going to jump in. And so thank you, Bill, as always, for being there and supporting us. Candace Kaiser is also on the call. Candace is also in Charleston, and you may have read many of Candace's blogs and articles on our website and in our newsletter. And please do opt into our newsletter whenever you have an opportunity right there on the firestorm.com website. Also, we'd like you to connect with us on Twitter at Firestorm Soul. On Facebook, we're Firestorm Solutions. We are continuity experts on YouTube. And we are Firestorm Solutions on LinkedIn and a bunch of other places as well. And anytime you have a question in any of the social applications, Instagram or others, just use the Crisis Coach hashtag and we'll be sure to see it and respond. If you'd like to ask a question or make a comment today, if you can use the GoToWebinar console on the right, you can type your question in the little chat area there and we will see it. And if we run out of time, we will respond post session, but I'd like to do something special today as well. As we go through the session, I'd like you to think of what the most important questions you have for your organization. And when the session is over, we'll compile a brief of the session. It'll be a 3 or 4 page summary of the session, but we will also include and respond to all of your questions as a fact within that document. So please take this opportunity to ask questions because we have a great guest and she will have some great responses for you, I know. As always, our attorneys would like us to say that this session is not complete without accompanying oral comments and discussion, and any work product provided should be read in conjunction with all guidance given by national, regional, local authorities, as well as your organization's personal counsel. Moreover, the information given and comments made in this webinar should not be interpreted as legal advice or legal opinion. You know us, we're Firestorm. We have a suite of services in crisis and risk, professional services solutions, people solutions, intelligence solutions, security solutions, and analytical solutions. If you have a question regarding anything in the crisis and risk management realm, please don't hesitate to reach out to us. I'd like to introduce you to Dr. Kathie Fleck. And one of the reasons I introduced Candace Kaiser earlier, other than the fact that we love and adore Candace Kaiser, is because Candace is an alumni of Ohio Northern University and brings us our relationship with Dr. Fleck. Dr. Fleck is the Assistant Professor of Communication and Media Studies at Ohio Northern and has more than 25 years of experience in private business, politics, government, nonprofit, faith-based organizations, and higher ed. In addition to teaching, she's a principal of KRF Consulting, and she works with clients in a wide range of industries. And her research interests do include crisis communication and political communication. And she is going to bring a great deal of depth to this conversation. If you've attended our webinars over the past 10 years, we've covered this subject. And so we wanted to bring a different point of view in keeping with our methodologies and approach, and Dr. Fleck is the perfect person to help us move that goal forward. So we're going to talk a little bit about some recent items that were in the news. And we were fortunate enough to have Dr. Fleck comment And on our blog, if you go to our website, you can read the last 2 or 3 articles that Dr. Fleck has written for Firestorm. So I wanted to introduce Kathie to you. Kathie, welcome to the session today. And I'd like to just start right off by asking you, why are we looking at the screen, and why did you write an article related to this, and how does it relate to what we're going to talk about today?
Thank you, Karen, and it is such a pleasure to join you and all of the folks listening today. So the 2 incidences that we're looking at were cases where executives communicated in a way that was considered offensive at best, and we're not accustomed to the executives being the ones for whom we have to worry about. And so this is a case where you need, as a communications person, to have a level of planning for when we see an executive misstep. And what does that look like? And I think that there are a lot of times that we can plan for big crises that happen outside of the C-suite, but we're not as comfortable and not as concerned necessarily with planning for an executive misstep. And we're seeing this quite a bit as we're so tied together digitally, and news and information travels so quickly from one place to the next that there isn't the opportunity for us to assume that conversations are private and that is not a potential for starting a crisis.
You know, and Kathie, I was in a recent shakeup at a major media organization, broadcast media, just yesterday. One of the chief executives, after one was released, memos surfaced of some other communications, and text messages are now more and more being used to highlight instances of abuse or a hostile workplace or other situations. And I think it's really critically important that people understand every piece of information you put out, has to be carefully considered, because it will be shared. And it will be shared not just within your organization, but to a much broader audience. Additionally, Kathie, I think people always assume the CEO is automatically the spokesperson for the organization, unless they have a larger company that may have a public relations arm. So we asked you, who are on this session today, to think about your own schools, your own universities, your own organizations, and asked you if you have predetermined messages for crisis response, if you have a designated spokesperson, and I want you to think about who that is. And then we asked you the question, must you respond to media inquiries during a crisis? Kathie, do you have any observations on what you see here?
Yes, I think it is interesting. The question on yes, the organization has a designated spokesperson. I would be interested in understanding who that person is. I think you're right that oftentimes we assume it's the CEO. Sometimes we assume it's the public relations person or the marketing person or the communications person. But oftentimes, in my experience, it depends on the crisis as to who the best person is. But anyone who's been designated as a spokesperson must have regular training to do so that they are well equipped, well practiced, and confident in their ability to speak to the various audiences that they're going to be addressing as the spokesperson for any organization.
You make a great point. So are you saying, as we create our message maps, we should also include a space or an area to indicate who actually will be the spokesperson for that type of event, so that in the case of a hurricane, we might have one person, but in the case of, let's say, a workplace accident or a school accident, we would have another? Is that what you're saying?
Yes, and I'm probably even going one step further. Let's say, Karen, that your designated spokesperson or your primary designated spokesperson is the person who's traveling on vacation during a hurricane and can't get home, and isn't able to speak to that crisis. So you really need a primary spokesperson, and then you need a secondary spokesperson who may very well be just a simple backup, or may well be an expert in a particular area that could speak to a specific incident. So let me give you a quick example. I used to work for the Ohio Environmental Protection Agency, and often it would be left to an engineer or a technical person in charge of a particular permit or a particular incident that would end up being a key spokesperson when something happened. It wasn't always the agency director. And so you really do need to denote who your key spokesperson is, and in many cases, perhaps the number two spokesperson or the next go-to person, if that person is available or the situation calls for additional expertise.
I think that's just a great point. It's a terrific observation. It makes a great deal of sense. And we can always give you examples of when people don't communicate well. We're not going to do that today. But if you'd like us to give you those examples, we're happy to do that. And the other thing, too, is the reason there are companies like Firestorm and your own consulting firm is when schools or other organizations or companies become overwhelmed, especially if it's a smaller organization, having a consultant come in who is objective, who also has exceptionally broad experience in all types of crises, suddenly becomes your trained spokesperson. Kathie is going to tell you some stories today about situations that, frankly, none of us would ever have experienced. So having someone on the bench who has deep, deep experience and has spoken to a like situation is really an enormous benefit in a crisis when you do need to make a statement. So let's talk about that. You know, at Firestorm, we want you to sit back and think before you immediately communicate. We want you to figure out why you're communicating. We're going to talk about that in a little bit. But we do understand that you may need to communicate with key constituencies, and now you have the opportunity to do that in a way that you never could before, because you can directly go to people via email, Twitter, text messages, SMS notifications, every social media application, and you can tweet or message directly to the media. And the reason we want you to have messages prepared is because you can immediately communicate so effectively. You're expected to immediately communicate so effectively. So we've got to have some messages available in case that's what our strategy is going to be. And why do we do that? We do that because certainly confusion costs us time. And we want to plan everything where we can so that when the crisis actually occurs, we can modify as we need to and reduce not only panic, but our own level of stress so that we can lead in the way our organizations need us to lead. Your students, your teachers, your staff are looking to whomever is in the crisis communication area for strong leadership. And by planning these things out in advance, you are exemplifying what we do want to see in a leadership situation. Many of you may have heard the story that our CEO tells quite often, and this is a week to relate this story in light of what did happen on September 11th. And he was in New York at the time at an organization, and he brought all of his senior management team into a conference room, and they were all deciding what their response needed to be. And Jim said to his senior HR person, listen, if our employees need to leave, they need to leave. They're thinking about their families, their friends. We need to do whatever we can to help them leave safely and facilitate them feeling good about making whatever decision they need to do. So go ahead and let's send a memo to people that if they need to leave, they can go ahead and leave. And his senior HR person was very shaken up and got back to her desk and got that memo out to everyone in the organization. But because she was so stressed and under such pressure, sadly, when the message went out, it said, instead of if you need to leave, go ahead and leave, it said if you want to live, leave. And it's troubling for us because it was so troubling for her. On top of this tremendous human tragedy we were witnessing, there's this one additional human tragedy that just didn't need to have happen. The guilt that she felt over that and the confusion it caused within the organization was significant. So, Kathie, on the tail end of that, why don't you tell us why you think message mapping is critical and your experience?
One of the things that I have noticed in crisis, both as an observer and as a participant, is that you cannot gauge what your reaction is going to be. I happen to be in a large downtown, very visible state capitol building when the Oklahoma City bombing happened. And I was on the top floor of this building, and my baby son was in the daycare on a lower floor of this building. And of course, when this happened, it was such a tragedy and everybody was watching it unfold. Well, prudent people needed to respond in state capitals and federal buildings across the country. And so my reaction at that time was different than it had ever been before. So I needed the comfort of having clear messaging set up ahead of time that would allow me to just build on that and to specify it rather than have to try to create something wholesale in that moment when I had a whole range of emotions going through me that normally would not happen to me as a trained spokesperson. And so that's the point of having message maps, is it takes a little bit of the unpredictability out of crises and allow you to be clearer and more coherent in your communication to a whole range of audiences. And of course, it helps you to think about all those audiences ahead of time versus on the fly as you are trying to navigate the situation at hand.
That's just great observations. I think we see that quite often, especially for all of those school organizations on the call today. We know when there's an incident that the first thing parents do is rush to the school, even if we might be trying to tell them we need you not to do that right now. We need you to go to this alternate place. So I understand completely. I mean, I can't imagine not running downstairs and grabbing my child and just feeling the comfort of them being safe. That's a really compelling story. Can you talk a little bit to, Firestorm has a philosophy that when we create a message map, we want everyone to ask why at least 5 times. Can you talk about why the why is even important, and how we start identifying who our audience is and what we want them to know and why?
Yeah, so I love this concept. It forces us to think deeply about each issue. It forces us to think deeply about our organization, and it forces us to think deeply about our audiences. And in doing so, all of us will have a gut reaction that we already know the answers, but we don't. And sitting there in a conference room, sort of banging through some of this planning, if we simply go with our initial gut reaction, we shortchange ourselves and don't give the time and the thought that's necessary to put into understanding who it is we're trying to talk to, what it is they're going to be feeling, and what communication needs to transpire between us and that audience in order to satisfy their need for information, and if at all possible, put them at ease that the situation is either being handled or will be handled or is under control and we're not in just simple chaos.
And I again, that just shows great, it's leadership. It's about leadership. And critical decision support is really at the core of what crisis and risk management is. It's how do you make decisions during critical times, because it's the difference between a bad decision and a bad decision often. And you don't have all of the information. Everything you learn in the first moments of a crisis may be completely invalid. And so we have to step back and say, okay, we've gone through this scenario before. We have some messaging created. As we learn more, we're going to be able to educate and clarify the people who are listening to us. So let's do it in a reasoned, mature, articulate manner so that we don't put people, their lives, their safety, their jobs, etc., at risk. So we just simply want to approach this in a mature way. And at Firestorm, we talk about home bases. And we want you to define this for your own organization. And we're going to talk a little bit about how you might go about defining that. We're going to talk about how you might go about defining stakeholders. And this was something that we did at Virginia Tech. We outlined 3 key messages, and we have used that for more than 10 years in one variation or another. And we started with, we will not be defined by the actual event. This event is not going to be who we are going forward forever. We will invent the future. So we're going to look at how we responded. We're going to look at what led to the event, if the event was something that was man-made. If it was something that nature brought upon us, we're going to look at how we can be more resilient in the future. And we're going to embrace all of those impacted by the event. Kathie, you had some thoughts on this approach. Do you work with a home base idea?
Absolutely. You can cripple an organization if you allow it to be defined by the event. Now, unfortunately, things that are going to happen that you are going to be associated with, right? We know lots of tragedies where you just list the name of the company or the name of the city, and we all know what you're talking about. But being defined by that event is quite different. You have the opportunity to move on and move forward, and you cannot allow the organization to be paralyzed or branded simply by the event itself. And of course, that puts you in a different posture where you are enabled then to invent the future and to come up with much more creative ways to address that. We also know where there have been crises where the event has happened. You can still name the event by the brand name, but you also have a very good feeling about that company because they did invent the future, and they were able to take that crisis and build an even stronger reputation. And then, of course, those being embraced by those impacted by the event. If ever we forget that there are humans on the other end of a crisis, that is in and of itself its own tragedy, and in and of itself can create its own secondary crisis. And so we always have to remember it is the people who are at the core of whatever is happening, internal or external, that we have to embrace, and keeping that at the forefront of our minds, I think is very critical for both the external communications as well as the internal decision making.
And I think all of us in our careers have seen incidences of that. And so to help you move forward, and when we finish our brief of this session, we'll put a couple of worksheets in the brief for you, just some of these blank worksheets. We're going to show you 2 or 3 variations as we go forward, so you can think a little bit about what might be appropriate for your organization. But there's no set thing you have to do. But Kathie, you had some good observations on this, and I'm going to scroll through the next 2 or 3 slides as you're talking, just so folks can see what maybe a message map template looks like and how you fill it in, and then how you go about identifying who should be distributed what, when, and how.
Yeah, so we know that in each of our organizations, there are some events that are more likely than others to happen. And those events can be more easily discerned and planned for in great detail. What I like about the sheet in front of you, it has the impact right up front. And that speaks to the last point that I just made about the fact that we have to embrace those who are affected by whatever crisis we're facing. So the impact also helps us prioritize. And the fact that it's so close up to what is happening, what is the potential impact, who is it impacting, and how are we going to address it. This particular order forces a particular strain of thought and strategy for all of us as we're designing these message maps. So in the case of an office closing, you're going to have certain impacts, right? Obviously, you've got internal audiences, your employees. You've got external audiences depending upon who might be coming that day. You've got vendors. It does allow us to think a little bit more deeply about how this could impact and have further reverberations down the line. So the stakeholders, there are obvious stakeholders, and sometimes they're not so obvious stakeholders, and those will vary a little bit by the particular incident. So a workplace incident or a shelter in place, how will we get to people if you're at a college campus, for example? How will you get that information out? Obviously, current students may be tied into an automatic notification system, but visiting parents may or may not be, vendors may or not be, speakers may or may not be. And so this gives you the opportunity to consider all of the possibilities, plan for both the impact as well as what messaging and how to get that message out to each one of those groups.
And, you know, Kathie, when we were talking in preparation for this session, there were a couple of events that came to mind that I was thinking of. One was in Baton Rouge, at the university in Baton Rouge, when there was a bomb threat. And the way information was communicated was done in such a way that everyone within the campus proper immediately fled the campus proper. But because no one notified the local police or local officials, there was no one to help them direct traffic. And so within 4 minutes, the entire campus, which is downtown, became gridlocked, and downtown became gridlocked. And if you were trying to escape a bomb, you would have been more successful walking quickly than trying to get in your car and drive away. So as we are planning out our messages, identifying who our key stakeholders are becomes critically important. What is the best way to go about that?
So from my standpoint, it is who is closest to the first impact. So when you consider a knowable and a reasonable event for your community. I happen to teach at a university that is located in the middle of a cornfield, literally carved out of a cornfield. We have significant... Yes.
I'm sorry. I said I've been there. It is. It's a beautiful place. A really beautiful place.
It's beautiful, but it's literally carved out of a cornfield with the grain elevator right next to it. And we have significant vulnerability to weather events. Snow, wind, rain, tornadoes. And so we know this. And so it is the prioritization of the most likely event and thinking all the way through that potential event that sort of brings us here. So once we decide that our main concern has to be for student and employee reaction and safety, then we can start to prioritize that. What is the impact? Who are we going to tell? What are we going to tell them? And how are we going to tell them? And then we move on to the next most impacted group, which would be potential visitors coming to campus, or it could be, in our case, we're in the middle of a very small community, right? And if we have students moving, or if there's something, we double the size of the community with just the students. It's a little bit like the Baton Rouge example. So what impact would it have on the community? So you sort of start with the most knowable events. I say, you need to take your top 5 and really deeply plan for those first, and really think about your obvious stakeholders who are going to be closest to and be impacted either directly or first in whatever crisis that you're considering.
Now, when we were talking about this session, the other thing that we talked about is that the bottom line is that every crisis is a human crisis. And, I remember there was a time when I was working with an educational organization, and there was a tree. A tree came down in an ice storm, and it took out the power, and so the school was going to be closed or had a late start because this tree came down and took out the power. And when the school put out an official communication about it, they said that the tree came down at about 5 a.m. in the morning. Well, on Facebook, a conversation started after this official announcement came out, where someone said a tree did not come down at 5 a.m. At 4 a.m., a driver hit a pole and knocked down the electricity. And the conversation focused on the detail of how the event happened instead of the event, the impact, and how we needed to move forward, which goes to my first point of how critically important it is to only quote those things we truly know in our communication. However, Kathie, you told me a story that was so poignant that I will never forget it, that not only about when it comes to accuracy, but when it comes to just how critically important our words are and how every crisis is a human crisis. Can you talk a little bit about that for me, Kathie?
Sure. When I was starting out as a fairly new graduate in state government in the state of Ohio, we had a crisis in the southern part of the state at one of our prisons. And we had one of the longest and most devastating prison riots to date, actually. In the midst of this crisis, we had, and this kind of goes back a little bit to the spokesperson discussion that we had earlier. It was an ongoing 24/7 crisis. Now, this was before social media, so it does not have that element in there, but you did have media camping out in a very small town, wanting information and data all of the time, which was driving the communications. There were prisoners were holding a guards hostage in this prison, and were negotiating with federal negotiators and state negotiators on trying to end the crisis, and they were trying to get the guards out alive. And in the midst of a press briefing, one of the junior spokespersons, who was not trained in negotiation tactics, was not trained in hostage tactics, and had some but very little media crisis training, was asked about the fact that they were getting, the media were getting intel that the prisoners were threatening to kill a guard. And her response was that was just all part of their negotiation tactics, that this was all part of the language of negotiation. And as a result, the prisoners heard this because they had radio and they could hear the results of these press briefings. And they made the choice to kill a guard so that it would appear that they were very serious and it was indeed not just the language of negotiations, which is a tragedy, of course, none of us as communicators ever want to be in. It was not a mistake that this individual probably made on her own. She may have been given instructions to say something along these lines, or it was her natural instinct based on other training that she had, but it stuck with her, and it's obviously stuck with me. The language would have been, we take every threat seriously, because at the end of the day, there's a human on the other end of that threat. And that is a lesson that has stuck with me for quite some time. And I teach my students every year. I have them in class so that they understand their responsibility as a spokesperson and understand the power of language.
I just think that's such a powerful, powerful story. And I really appreciate you sharing it with us. And it helps us also understand why you have such a passion for what you do. So thank you very much. And as someone who has employed one of your students, I can say that y'all did a great job. So let's move forward now. And I do want everyone to take that with the sincerity of purpose that it was shared. Let's talk, however, about how we are sharing information today. And we know that newspapers are businesses, right? So are schools. And everybody needs to find a way to fund whatever it is they're doing. And so when newspapers approach us, it's because they have a story, they have an angle, and they want to sell what it is they're selling. And as someone who works with the media quite often, I can tell you that we're very clear and we're very careful that we understand the angle of the story that the media wants to present, because we need to make sure that it aligns with our values and the values of our organization. TV news has pretty much become somewhat entertainment. They're selling ad time, creates some controversy. We hear the word sound bites, and sound bite is already something that I hate, the words. It's the media's text message. But Kathie, you and I both agree that there's one word we really despise, even more than that right now, and it's optics. When someone says to me, well, we really have to get out in front of the optics on this thing, I'm sorry, I really have a difficult time with that, because giving new words to old things isn't going to make them any different. We really just need to be clear and careful and articulate, and remember that there are people behind every crisis or every tragedy. Do understand social media. If you don't, give us a call, let us help you. But understand how it not only is used to listen, because we want you to listen all the time so that if a crisis is coming, you can avert it, but also understand you have a grave responsibility when you're messaging out. You know, when 10 years ago when Twitter first came out of the box, people were like, oh great, let's put an intern on that. Let's put someone who's, heck, I had people putting high schoolers in there because they said social media was a young person's thing. Well, any communication is a mature person thing. That doesn't mean an older person. It doesn't have to do with age. It has to do with the maturity of understanding of communication. Kathie, can you speak to that for me for just a moment? Because it has such a huge impact. And right now, our country has seen the best and the worst of social communication. But if nothing else, we've seen how social media can be used to drive global points of view.
Absolutely. My students at this point in time do not know a world without communicating on social media. When we discuss keeping up on current events, their go-to platforms are social media. And we know that through many surveys, through Pew Research and other research organizations, we see more and more people, their primary vehicle for getting news is becoming more and more reliant on social media. And so understanding the dynamics of each different platform what works on each different platform, how to listen on each different platform, is really crucial for any crisis plan, as well as any general plan. And deciding whether or not to communicate on all those different platforms is another decision that you have to make, because you're going to have to be able to monitor as well. And depending on the size of your staff and depending on the size of your organization, your ability to monitor and to communicate properly on a social channel is really important.
And you have to know your brand, who you are. So your school, your organization, whether you're a brand new or you've been around for 150 years, what are your values? How do you articulate those in your messages? What is the mission of your organization? What is your strategy on risk? You may have a culture where your tolerance for risk or risky messages is higher than others. What is your communication policy? And if you don't have one, you surely do need one. And again, we keep asking, why do we communicate? Now, Kathie, let's talk to this. This is the why, right? The why of communication. And I'd like you to speak to this and a little bit on maturity and transparency as well.
So trust is a concept that we know that we need, and we know that we need to maintain. I don't know that we are all that adept across the board at understanding how we do build it and how we do maintain it. Consistency alone is not trust, but it is a component of trust. Trust goes to affinity and to values and to a range of different concepts that we need to take into consideration when we are both building and maintaining. And certainly we need to understand which piece of the trust broke when we're having to restore it. Truth is non-negotiable. We're in a day and age where there is quite a bit of debate about what's true and what isn't true. We see more and more that people are slighting that concept to mean what is true for me may or may not be true for you. But when we're talking about crisis, there are certain facts and information that we have an obligation to be very clear and as truthful as we are capable of being, and as transparent as is appropriate to be during the crisis, and certainly then after the crisis, in disclosing as much detail and as much information going forward to then continue to build, maintain, or restore trust if and when we find that that's broken in a crisis.
And we talked a bit about transparency, and I think people get confused about what that means. You know, we really want a mature program. We want to start there, and you get a mature program through a lot of different steps that we can assist you with, but you want to start with assigned roles and responsibilities. Kathie has mentioned at the top of our session that you may not have the same person always speaking to the public or to your employees, internally or externally, depending on the situation. We want to have really good home bases and message maps, and we'll give you some templates of those when you download our brief, or you can just give us a buzz and we'll send them to you. We need to understand through a culture of our organizations that we need to communicate in a disciplined, organized, articulate manner. But then we hear transparency talked about quite often. And we've got a couple of minutes left. I'm sorry I talked a little bit too much, but I really want to hear your thoughts on transparency, Kathie, because I think they're really insightful.
So transparency means telling what you know that you can verify, that you feel is both appropriate and responsible. It is not telling everything you know. It is not telling everything you've heard. We see a lot of that go on social channels, and that can cause secondary crisis in and of itself when we feel compelled or we allow ourselves to be pushed by whatever individual or group that's pushing us to discuss everything out on public channels. So it is being honest that there is some information that we have that we need to verify before we release, It is being, but here's what we know and here's what we have now that we feel confident in releasing. And it is understanding that you will need to potentially then communicate more often as you are getting updates that you can both verify and feel comfortable with.
Now, you tell everyone when they leave this session, you want them to think of these three things. Speak a little bit about this for me.
Yeah, so message mapping is an insurance policy, right? You don't want to use it if at all possible, but it's irresponsible not to have it. If you have not planned for the eventuality of a crisis, you are not appropriately protecting your organization. And then you've got to prioritize. You know, we all have limited time. There's limited space in a day. There's limited opportunity, but you have to prioritize what are the 5 most likely potentials that could happen to your organization, prioritize them, deeply work on them, and then work your way down and out from there. And then, of course, you have communication. You have both social channels, as we've discussed already, as well as traditional media, meaning online websites or, print pieces, sometimes flyers. I mean, sometimes that is what we're looking to do, as well as then working with the actual media, such as news outlets that are important. And so using all of the available tools that we have and planning for all those eventualities is what helps us successfully manage a crisis and not to inadvertently create a secondary crisis.
And why is this quote important to you?
It is putting the responsibility where it lies, and that's on us, to look into the future, look into what possibly could happen, because we all know that a crisis is not if, but when, and allowing you the space to prioritize doing something about that crisis now, knowing that it will pay off when that day comes.
You know, I just realized when I asked you that question, that slide may not have been up for you yet, so that may have seemed a little confusing, so I apologize. Sometimes when you forward slides on one end, it doesn't go as quickly on the other, so I do apologize. I love this quote. Planning is bringing the future into the present so that you can do something about it now, and that's that time machine concept. Kathie, I have so much enjoyed working with you on this session, and I look forward to more blog contributions from you and other sessions as we move into 2019. For everyone on this call, your school, your organization, please download any of our resources from the Firestorm website. And once we have transcribed the brief from this session and put together some of the templates for you and posted it on our website, everyone who is registered for this session, whether you attended or for those who couldn't attend, we'll go ahead and send a link out so you can download that. And it will also have Dr. Fleck's information in it as well. Please contact Firestorm at any time if you need an assistance, and we'll explain our Crisis Stop and Crisis Coach programs. You can also download our Communicating During a Crisis infographic right now if you really need to have something from our website, and we look forward to having you do that. I want to thank you very much for your time today. If you have any questions now, this is a great time to email us at webinars@firestorm.com. We're going to collect all your questions and add them to that brief document. We'll have a section for schools and a section for business. So please just write webinars@firestorm.com and ask us any questions you may have after today's session. We do have a session at 2 o'clock for the business community. You have 10 minutes. You can register for that if you'd also like to listen to any of these key points again. And we look forward to talking with all of you next month. Kathie, I'll look forward to talking to you in just a few minutes on our next session. Bill Baker and Candace, thank you also for supporting this session today. This will end our session. Thank you and goodbye.